في أعماقنا الإيمان كالحجارة قسوة فإن القرآن حين
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين، والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين، على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome to our series, Reflections on the Qur'an. In this episode, I'd like to talk about Quranic arguments. There are some people who say that the Qur'an really doesn't make rational arguments. That was a point that was made by some of the philosophers who were working within Islamic civilization in the classical era. They said, people are of three types. There are the free thinkers who are able to handle abstract concepts, people like us. Then there are people who can kind of deal with abstract concepts, but they're not free thinkers. They're working within a limited context or frame of reference. So they referred to the fuqaha, the ulama of Islam, as Ahlul Kalam, and they considered themselves to be above that second group. And then they said, and then there's your average person who really can't think at all, and they just go based on emotion. And because the Qur'an is addressed to people in general, you can't expect the Qur'an to develop philosophical arguments like ours. It has to deal with the lowest common denominator, people who can't really think and they just go on the basis of emotion. And so the Qur'an makes its points in terms of stories that appeal to the emotion of the masses without any rational arguments being employed. Now, that view has been challenged by Muslim scholars, so this is the topic of this session. And when it comes to argument, we know that this is a part of human nature. Allah said in Surah Al-Kahf, وَكَانَ الْإِنسَانُ أَكْثَرَ شَيْءٍ جَدَلًا. The human being is more than anything disputatious, given to argument. And the Qur'an reproduces in the context of its stories of the prophets confronting various people, it reproduces the arguments, the debates between the prophets and their opponents, let's say, those who don't accept what it is that the prophets are calling them to. And so there's the use of argument and counter-argument in those debates that are recorded in the Qur'an. So we also see that the Qur'an commands the Prophet ﷺ, and by implication the believers, to use good style of argument in order to convey the message that Allah had entrusted the Prophet ﷺ with, and that He has entrusted His followers with after him. ادْعُوا إِلَى سَبِيلِ رَبِّكَ بِالْحِكْمَةِ وَالْمَوْعِظَةِ الْحَسَنَةِ وَجَادِلْهُمْ بِالَّتِي هِيَ أَحْسَنُ. Call to the way of your Lord with wisdom and fair exhortation, and reason with them in the better way or the best way. So, Quranic arguments, we agree with the philosophers, Quranic arguments are not constructed in the way that philosophers construct arguments. But there's a point that Sheikh Idris, who I had the privilege to work with for a while, and I think he's done some shows on Peace TV. I used to translate some of his articles, and I found his writing to be a real pleasure to translate because of the clarity of his thought. And one of the articles I translated was an article on Islamic philosophy. And one of the points he made in that is that there are as many schools of philosophy as there are philosophers. What philosophers have in common is the kind of issues that they discuss, that they think about. And although they strove to develop a body of knowledge, a methodology of thought which we call logic, in order to identify valid rational arguments as opposed to invalid rational arguments. Despite that attempt, every philosopher has his own take on the issues. So how is it that if this methodology is supposed to result in people reaching the truth, why is it that every philosopher has a different take on those issues that they all discuss? Now, someone could make the same point in the sense that about many issues in Islamic law, for instance, the great scholar of Islam had different opinions about detailed rulings. And we know that there were also schools of thought in Islam. So even about issues of belief, it's possible to have different takes on those issues. There is a core belief, however, that Muslims hold in common, despite some differences which may be slight or substantial. But what that tells us is that ultimately logic doesn't lead to one conclusion. At the end of the day, people still have differences in the way they approach certain issues. And for me, one of the most interesting manifestations of this aspect of humanity, that we have a rational part of our mind and we have an irrational part. One of the great logicians of the 20th century was Kurt Gödel, who was a mathematician and a logician. And he basically blew out of the water what it was that mathematicians have been trying to do, which was to develop this all-comprehensive logic that would be, of course, internally consistent. And he provided a mathematical proof for why that wasn't possible. And so he's considered not only one of the greatest logicians of the 20th century, but of all time. Near the end of his life, Gödel, who fled the Nazi occupation of Europe, he was an Austrian. He settled in Princeton. He was a personal friend of Einstein. Near the end of his life, he became convinced that people were trying to poison him. And so he stopped eating. And that was his cause of death. He actually starved to death. Although he was a brilliant logician, in the way that his own mind worked, there were certain things that that went wrong in the use of his intellect. So anyway, the Quranic arguments are not constructed like philosophers' arguments, and they address people's fitrah. And one of the major ways that the Quran argues is to call people's attentions to the signs in the world around us, which are indications of not only the existence of the Creator. As many people have pointed out, if it's the Creator talking to you, he's not going to try to prove that he exists. What he's doing is calling people's attention to his attributes, which are reflected in the way the universe is constructed. That the order in the universe gives us an indication of the wisdom of its designer. There's an indication of design in the way the universe is put together. There's an indication of beneficence in the way that Allah has provided for human beings what they need. And so like that, the various signs of Allah that He calls people's attention to in many, many, many verses of the Qur'an, they build up this sense that who Allah is, and also they should develop a sense of reverence in the heart and the mind of the listener, and a sense of indebtedness. I owe Allah everything, so what can I do to express gratitude? So that's a real major aspect of the way the Qur'an argues. You know, a major example of that, إِنَّ فِي خَلْقِ السَّمَاوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضِ وَاخْتِلَافِ اللَّيْلِ وَالنَّهَارِ لَآيَاتٍ لِأُولِي الْأَلْبَابِ. Indeed, in the creations of the heavens and earth, and in the difference of night and day, are tokens. Tokens of what? Tokens of Allah's sovereignty for men of understanding. And the passage goes on, I'll just read it in the English. Those who remember Allah, standing, sitting, and reclining, and consider the creations of the heavens and the earth and say, our Lord, you didn't create this in vain. Glory be to you. Preserve us from the doom of fire. Let's take a break and we'll be back.
Tawheed is the basis of Islam, submission to God. Character is shaped by faith. Belief in God and righteous conduct can never be separated. Learn how Tawheed builds character with me, Yahya Ibrahim, only on Peace TV.
Visualize the character which uproots darkness and stands firm against every injustice. Join Yahya Ibrahim in Tawheed Builds Character every Tuesday at 4 p.m. and repeat telecast at 1:30 a.m. UK on Peace TV. He faces.
I have two questions.
He listens.
My question is about the beard, about Imam Mahdi.
What are the people believing?
He answers.
So number one is the help of Allah.
He satisfies in the light of glorious Qur'an and authentic Hadith.
If Allah helps you, believe me, you have to get success.
Catch Dr. Zakir.
Then we have the next call, please.
To get convincing and valid answers in Dial Dr. Zakir every Thursday at 6:30 p.m. and repeat telecast at 9:30 a.m. UK on Peace TV.
I wanted to share with you some of the ayat of the Qur'an and some of the ahadith of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam.
Care and affection, guidance and encouragement, dedication and vision,
which give us an indication and an instruction,
uplifting the horizons of the child in an Islamically sound way,
as to how to be good Muslim parents.
Muhammad Tim Humble.
Welcome to a brand new series, 26 ways to be a good Muslim parent.
Imbibe the various qualities of ideal parents essential for their children's upbringing and betterment from 26 ways to be a good Muslim parent. Next on Peace TV.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Welcome back. So we're talking about the way that Allah develops arguments in the Qur'an. One of the major ways is to remind people about His signs, calling our attention to aspects of the world around us and what that infers about their Creator and what that calls forth, what it requires a person who admits and recognizes those signs to do in order to establish the proper relationship with the Creator of those signs. Now, it's not simply an intellectual exercise. There's a kind of a psychological pressure also being applied by calling attention to these signs. Now, because of time, let's just look at the English translation. In Surah Qasas, say, have you thought, if Allah made night everlasting for you till the day of resurrection, who is a God beside Allah who could bring you light? Will you not then hear? Say, have you thought, if Allah made day everlasting for you till the day of resurrection, who is a God beside Allah who could bring you night wherein you rest? Will you not then see? So, our study of the heavens makes this point even more pertinent, because there are planets like Mercury where there's one side that always faces the sun. As it rotates around the sun, there's one side that's always getting sunlight and one side that's always facing into space and is dark. Mercury has no atmosphere, so there's no way to average out the temperature. The side that's facing the sun, if a person were to set foot on that planet on that side, they would melt straight away. I mean, you would just die, it's so hot. And if you were on the back side of the planet, there's no atmosphere, so it's below zero, and you would freeze to death. So the fact that the Earth turns on its axis and that we have an atmosphere in order to distribute the heat, that makes the Earth habitable. And, I've heard of this terrible torture. Some people were tortured by having their eyelids cut off. So what do you do when you want to sleep and you're in that condition? There's no way that you can ever shut out the light. And, you'd have to have some kind of goggles or something to give any relief in that situation. So Allah created the night and the day. He gave us eyelids to shut out the light. These are aspects of His signs. So when He's calling our attention to these things, it's in order to evoke a response, an emotional response. It's like, I should recognize the kindness that's being poured upon me by this Creator and this Sustainer. So what should I be doing? I should be looking for a way to express gratitude. Another method that the Qur'an uses is to ask questions. Now, this was a question. Another question, أَفَرَأَيْتُم مَا تُمْنُونَ أَأَنْتُمْ تَخْلُقُونَهُ أَمْ نَحْنُ الْخَالِقُونَ? Have you seen that which you emit, talking about semen? Is it you who create it, or are we the creator? If you could create that, then you would be able to have children according to your recipe. And another example of that, أَمْ خُلِقُوا مِنْ غَيْرِ شَيْءٍ أَمْ هُمُ الْخَالِقُونَ? It's a question that poses certain possibilities. Were they created from nothing? How could that be? Nothingness cannot create. Or did they create themselves? Well, you'd have to already exist in order to be able to create, so clearly that can't happen. And so the other possibility is that there's a creator who doesn't need anything in order to exist, and He's the one who created you and created everything else. And this is an example of an argument that in English is called eliminating the possibilities. So a number of possibilities are mentioned. The third one is not mentioned because it's so obvious. And so then, by a process of elimination, the possibilities that really can't be accepted as viable, they're eliminated, and what's left is the correct possibility or the correct interpretation of a phenomenon. There's a lot of analogies also used in the Qur'an. Frequently, in order to argue for the possibility of resurrection after death, Allah, He poses, again, a question. In Surah Qaf, verse 15, the translation, were we then worn out by the first creation, yet they are in doubt about a new creation? So, given that Allah is all-powerful and that He had the power to create the universe to begin with, why would it be a problem for Him to bring people back to life after having brought them into existence originally, caused them to die? Why is that difficult for Him to bring them back to life? And in another verse, is not He, it's another way of making the same argument, is not He who created the heavens and the earth able to create the like of them? Aye, that He is, for He is the all-wise Creator. And then Allah used the analogy of sending down rain, and the earth, which looks dead. The Arabs were familiar with the desert. What happens in the desert is that it just looks dead, and then after a rain, poof, the next day, bam, there's all this green stuff that has grown up. And so this is a kind of sign that if Allah can do that, then He can also bring people out of their graves. So there are many examples of that. Another way that we see rational argument in the Qur'an is where the Qur'an exposes inconsistency in the opponent's position. So if you accept the existence of God, which the pagan Arabs did, and if you accept the possibility of resurrection, which the pagan Arabs did not, they were being argued against, and perhaps this argument was devoted at people who did accept that, then why would you think that Allah would treat those who are obedient in the same way as He treats those who are disobedient. That doesn't make sense. So in Surah Al-Jathiyah, this point is made. Again, we'll just rely on the translation in order to save time. Or do those who commit ill deeds suppose that we will make them as those who believe and do good works, the same in life and death? So do you think that you'll be treated the same way? Bad is their judgment. And Allah has created the heavens and the earth with truth. And in order that every soul be repaid what it has earned, and they will not be wronged. So if Allah made this whole earth, this universe, in order to test people, then it doesn't make sense that people who just do their own thing and pay no regard to Allah's instructions on how to live their lives, that He would treat them in the same way as people who restrain themselves within the limits of Allah. The claim of the pagan Arabs was that the angels were the offspring of Allah, His daughters. And of course, the Christians make the same claim with regard to Jesus, that He was the Son of God. So Allah says, the originator of the heavens and the earth, how can He have a child when He has no wife, when He created all things and is aware of all things? So let's define our terms here. What do you mean by child? Child has a meaning which refers to a biological process. And wherever there are children, there is sexual reproduction, a male and a female. And Allah is unique. There's nothing like Him. There's no counterpart to Allah. So if He didn't have a wife, how can He have a child? So this also raises the inconsistency in the Christian concept of Mary. They call her the Mother of God with regard to Jesus. How can she be the Mother of God? She's a creation of God. So, it creates logical problems for people who have that position. And so at the end of the day, they say, well, it's a mystery, you just have to believe. And consistently, you see this idea in the popular presentation of Christianity that there's logic and reason, and then there's faith. And I know that faith is not logical, but you have to believe, because you can't live without faith. And that kind of a dichotomy and that kind of a choice is never presented in Islam. Faith and rationality are not opposed. The Muslim's faith is supposed to be based upon rational process. So we've come to the end of this episode. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Subhanak Allahumma wa bihamdik. Ashhadu an la ilaha illa ant. Astaghfiruka wa atubu ilayk.
اقرأ أخيا ورتل القرآن اصبح بصوتك اسمع الأكوان اقرأ كلام الله داوي نفوسنا لنحس في أعماقنا الإيمان فإذا وعن القرآن حين لنا من فؤاد كالحجارة بسمة.
Explore the options. Match the qualities. Assure the success.
What happens at school, or more specifically, what happens inside the classroom. Good qualities of classrooms. Interact